Hey there, it's Matea. Thanks for taking the time to listen to Bookends today. If you've been enjoying our show, it would be a huge help for us, and I think also for you, to follow us on your favorite podcast app, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, whatever app you use to listen. This will ultimately help us make more Bookends episodes and connect you with more of your favorite authors. I hope you enjoyed today's show. Thanks so much for listening. Hey there, I'm Matea Roach, and welcome to Bookends. How can you be sure that you really know a person? Can you say that you know someone if there are major parts of their life that remain closed to you? These are big questions, and these are questions that I was thinking about when I was reading Nigel Thomas's latest novel, A Different Hurricane. A Different Hurricane is set on the lush Caribbean island country of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, where two young men, Gordon and Alan, become secret lovers until the strictures of their society force them apart. Avoiding their truth and repressing their queer identities comes at a cost to both them and the people around them. Nigel Thomas was born in Saint Vincent, and he was just 21 years old when he immigrated to Montreal all the way back in 1968. Since then, he's published fiction, poetry, literary criticism, works really that run the gamut, and all of it is drawn on his experiences as a gay man from the Caribbean. I reached Nigel Thomas at CBC's Montreal studio. Hi, Nigel. How are you?
Oh, hello, Matteo. I'm fine, thank you. And what about you?
I'm not too bad, thank you.
Good.
Nigel, you have a very deep and wide body of work, as I mentioned in the introduction, and a lot of your fiction explores this struggle of being often a young person and queer in the Caribbean, and you also delve into some immigrant experiences. What brings you to write narratives that are in this space?
To begin with, I think I write out of a basic mystery, the mystery of the human condition. That probably is what drove me to write in the first place, beginning with poetry. However, in terms of the novel, there are the broader issues that affect us. My way of negotiating or contemplating those issues is actually to engage my imagination, and the result is invariably fiction.
I know one thing you've been asked a lot before in interviews is how your identity and experiences inform your fiction, kind of talking about, well, how does queerness inform your fiction? How does Blackness or being from the Caribbean inform your fiction? Do you feel that that's a reasonable question to ask, I guess, about your writing?
I think anything that the book raises, any question that the book raises is valid. I would downplay the queerness sometimes in an attempt to get the interviewer to focus on the broader issues that I deal with, like, for example, parent-child relationships, the educational system. There are other times when I would focus on the queer issue because that might just be the more important topic, especially when we're dealing with, let's say, issues like homophobia and what democracy might mean in those places where queer people are denied a voice.
Well, I hope we're going to delve into, I think, really all of the issues that you just mentioned, but I want to talk about A Different Hurricane and specifically this sort of queer story that we see unfolding in it, because it seems to sit to me in this place where it's a nuanced portrayal, right? There's often two kinds of queer stories that we see when we hear about queer immigrant experiences of people leaving a country, coming to Canada, going to the UK, going to the US, where either you have an unhappy queer person who's kind of dealing with homophobia, dealing with persecution in their home country, or perhaps like a journey to liberation in a Western country and finding happiness. I feel like A Different Hurricane operates in a more complex space. Like, what sort of a queer story were you trying to tell here?
This story comes out of issues that have been roiling in my conscious and subconscious for many, many years. Certainly since AIDS struck us back in the 1980s. For example, you're dealing with queers who are masquerading as heterosexuals. And I can think of two particular cases in which these men infected their wives with AIDS, and it was only when their wives were infected that they actually discovered that their husbands were gay. And so that situation actually is kind of replicated in a different hurricane. There's also a personal dimension. I almost went down that route. Just before coming to Canada, I was engaged to be married to a woman, and I certainly was in the closet, had no intentions of coming out of it. And it leaves me wondering, had I gone down that path, what would my life have been? So there are many, many issues that my imagination engaged with to create a different hurricane.
That's fascinating, imagining the space of what could have been. I'm wondering, speaking for yourself, and I suppose speaking for perhaps people who are in that kind of situation where they're deciding, am I going to be closeted and live in a heterosexual marriage and kind of be on the down low, or am I going to move somewhere where I can live more openly? What are the sorts of dynamics at play in that kind of situation? Because we see different characters in your novel handle this very differently, and it is kind of an investigation into all of the different ways it can play out. Yeah.
There is Joseph, who actually does leave Saint Vincent and settles in Toronto. And there is Gordon, who comes to Montreal, studies, stays here for 4 years, but goes back home. And he had no illusions about what he was going back to. He had already seen the persecution that openly gay men endured. But for Gordon, it was more important to be a parent, to father his daughter, than his own sexuality.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious then, for your own biography, because you have a very interesting story of migration to Canada coming in 1968. You've been in Montreal for a very long time.
Right.
What was it that sort of tipped the scales for you that you were going to move here and make your life in Montreal?
Well, that homosexuality was certainly not on the list, really. I wanted a university education, and I come from a very relatively poor background, financially speaking. And so there was no possibility of my coming here as a paid student. So I emigrated from Saint Vincent primarily to go to university. And when I came, I did think I would return to the Caribbean. And in fact, at one point I did apply for a job in Jamaica. I laugh today as I think about that. No, but I came here and discovered really that I wasn't obliged to wear the mask of heterosexuality. And it gave me an opportunity, of course, to get out of my engagement and to have somewhat of a gay life, even though I did not make it a public issue until well on, in fact. The publication of my first novel sort of set the way or laid the foundation for me to come out of the closet. So that novel was published in 1993, and I made a public declaration in 1994. In, of all places, the press in my home island, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. You wouldn't want to hear what the result was.
Oh, my. Well, I actually feel that I do kind of almost want to hear what the result was. But first, you're talking about making that public coming out in the context of your first novel. What was it about releasing a novel that set the stage for you to feel like you wanted to make some sort of public acknowledgement or declaration in that way?
Well, my novel was the very, very first Caribbean novel with an identifiable queer character. And the Caribbean readership, however small it was, wasn't prepared for that. Not even the black community here was prepared for that. And so the question came up quite often. What am I going to say if I'm confronted? Nigel Thomas, you've created a character who is very much up in arms about his sexuality. Are you yourself gay? Could I possibly then say no? So I really had to just simply state the truth. I had been advised by friends who had read the novel to remove the gay content, but I felt it should be there. And probably subconsciously, I was telling myself, it's time to come out of the closet.
Wow. I mean, the stakes of a story like that are kind of unbelievable when you think about what it meant to come out anywhere, first of all, in the 90s, what it means to come out in the Caribbean even now. A Different Hurricane, I think, is really an exploration of what it is to be a queer man in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, where throughout the course of the novel, we see homosexuality is not just shunned socially, but remains a crime, even into the 2010s.
Exactly.
And despite this, we have, as you mentioned, your protagonist, Gordon, who initially finds love with Alan, who's another gay young man from a nearby village. And that's like back in the 80s. This is a story that spans generations. And they remain lovers for a long time and then are platonic friends for a while after that.
Right.
What is life like, I suppose, in your novel and also just like now, even in 2025, for a queer person living in Saint Vincent and the Grenadines?
Well, it's pretty much as it's depicted in the novel. The novel contains a few incidents that are thinly masked actual events. The extortion, the killings sometimes, those are real. St. Vincent is still one of those islands where homosexuality is criminalized. It has resisted the trend in the other islands. But to be mocked, to be called names, to be beaten up, you're goaded into. People say stuff to you and you respond in kind, and the next thing is that it's followed by violence. The other thing too, people are loath to go to the police because they're often themselves very homophobic. So it's that very uncertain space in which you live. You are never quite sure when you leave your home in a good mood whether you're going to return to it in the same mood, because I remember as a boy, I ran the gauntlet as I walked from Dixon to the neighboring town, Georgetown. We called all sorts of names. There might be a bit less of that today, but just a bit less.
Mm. Do you have any theories about why it is? You mentioned that other islands in the Caribbean have seen a bit of an opening up in terms of laws changing around homosexuality, and St. Vincent has remained a little bit frozen in place. Do you have any idea of why that might be?
In the case of St. Vincent, I think it came down to the religion of the judge, the magistrate who determined the case. The argument that she accepted was the argument given by the church. And in her judgment, she said that she was not going to repeal the law because the law was a bulwark against immorality. So, in the case of the other islands, it probably also comes down to who the justices were.
Nigel, A Different Hurricane plays with timelines and takes advantage of this framing device where we're actually reading journal notes at one point that come from this character, Maureen, who's Gordon's recently deceased wife. And you alluded earlier to wives of down low queer men being important figures that you were considering in writing this novel. Can you tell me a bit about Maureen and what sort of a situation she was in writing this journal that we get to read?
Well, she's just retired, an early retirement, premature, because she was diagnosed with full-blown AIDS. And it's also the occasion that she discovers that her husband is gay. She needs to make sense of what has happened to her. Initially, she thought she was writing a memoir, but it turns out in the end to be a journal. She was an English teacher in high school, and so she possesses the skills to explore via language what has indeed happened to her. And that journal is very important insofar as it's responsible for much of the novel's content. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, without giving too much away, it certainly drives a lot of the action of the novel.
Right.
There's a real moral complexity, I feel, at play with a lot of your characters. I'm wondering if you can talk maybe a bit about how you sort of crafted that complexity, because I felt like every character in this novel had turns where I felt that they were behaving a bit villainously or in a way that was not kind to other characters. And also every character suffers in some way where I really felt for them. It was an incredibly complex story.
Yep, it's holding up the mirror to nature. To seek perfection in human beings is to sort of set out on a fool's path. Even so, some of the characters are better than others. Let me put it that way. I suppose you can take a character like Maureen's mother, who is admirable in terms of how she manages to raise Maureen on her own and so on and so forth. Her own travail is quite a difficult one. On the other hand, she's virulently homophobic. And Gordon's sister, with whom he's very, very, very close, she too is homophobic. And I think the reason for it is that if you live in an environment where homophobia is a vital or an important part of the matrix, it's impossible to escape it. These are people who are conditioned to interpret reality in terms of biblical texts. And so, for example, they would simply say, well, I don't agree with homosexuality because it's written in the Bible, male and female created he them, and I'd be damned if, I believe anything else. So, yeah, that's the environment that shapes these people. And I'm not sure you can do very much about it. Even in those islands where gay sex is no longer criminalized, that's just on paper.
Yeah, there's a lot that has to happen in order for a culture to shift beyond just laws shifting, I suppose.
Exactly.
Nigel, I want to pivot back to your arrival in Canada when you came here to work and to study, and your choice to move to Montreal, because this is something that we see play out in your novel as well, where Gordon, your character in A Different Hurricane, comes to Canada for university. We see a little bit of what gay life was like or could have been like for him there. What was gay life like for you living in Montreal, arriving at a time where homosexuality wasn't totally out in the open in Canada either?
Well, yeah, I'm still to make sense of it for myself. I think I was very fortunate to have had the upbringing I had. Today I'm an atheist, but I was raised a Methodist in a very, 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 pretty much the sort of Methodism that you witness in Gordon's household. And that gave me a kind of a discipline to negotiate gay life here. I think I was astonished by this sort of sexual freedom that gay men allow themselves. And I had to remind myself that it probably was not a wise thing to enjoy to its full, or perhaps beyond its full, the sexuality that, I could have enjoyed here, and remind myself that I was here to go to school. And I wasn't supposed to be going to the bars, as I saw some black acquaintances do 7 nights a week, sort of. So, yeah, there was a sexual freedom that required a certain discipline to resist, in a way, if one was going to achieve one's objectives.
Mm. You've spoken in other interviews about the sort of racial dynamics of the gay scene in Montreal at the time that you were coming out. And I've heard from people that I know who've spent time in Montreal that there's still a bit of, I would say, racism within the queer scene in Montreal that can manifest. What was it like specifically being a Black person? Like, were there other out Black gay men in your community that you were around? How did that play out?
There were many, many gays. In the early years, let's say in 69, 70, there were not that many. But in 1980, There were many, many. I've estimated that there might have been about a good 150 blacks who were gay. You would see them over time. Yeah, I mean, I did go dancing on Saturdays when I was able to. And I would see them, chat with some of them, and so on and so forth. I don't know what the gay scene here now is because I'm an older man in a relationship myself. And I'd rather stay home and read than go to a club and just look around because it doesn't fill a need. Yeah, there is racism, and the big problem is being turned into some sort of a fetish. There's a sort of a black fetish. It's not just in the gay world, it's right across the culture. And it has to do with the way blacks were depicted during slavery and later on in the 19th century and beyond. And those fantasies have been diffused throughout the culture. I remember saying to someone, if I sleep with someone, I don't want to be considered a myth. I would want my full humanity to be acknowledged. And yeah, that was the problem.
Mm. That phrase of wanting one's full humanity to be acknowledged, I think, has such like a profound resonance through many parts of the conversation we've been having. A desire to be seen in totality and not for only one part of one's identity.
Exactly.
A Different Hurricane, I think, paints a very vivid picture of life in Saint Vincent over the decades with these little forays into life in Canada. Your character, Gordon, goes back to Saint Vincent despite having experienced a taste of a different life in Canada. He wants to return home to be a father to his daughter. Can you walk me through a little bit what some of those conflicted feelings might be towards Saint Vincent, that this is a place of home, it's a place of family, but is also somewhere that constricts your character so much?
Yeah, I think that is played out in that section where he is tempted to have a relationship with his colleague, the fellow who researches for him, Joseph. And there, of course, is where he sort of thinks about the sort of sterile life as regards the other part of his sexuality that he cannot live, for all the reasons that many gays, in fact, flee Saint Vincent, Joseph being one of them. I think if you were to ask Gordon, and of course you can't ask him, if it was worth going back to Saint Vincent to raise his daughter, he would say yes. And in fact, as you see in the novel, she is his one big accomplishment and the joy of his life. But still in all, it's a sterile situation. Alan, his ex-boyfriend and now very close friend, opts for something quite different. He's decided he's going to serve both aspects of his sexuality, both the heterosexual and the homosexual. And of course, well, we won't get into what happens.
Yeah, read the novel to see how that plays out for everybody involved. I'm curious, you mentioned earlier this idea that this novel was almost a way of playing out a road not taken in your own life, imagining how things might have been if you'd made certain different decisions, if you had married a woman and stayed in Saint Vincent. We see your character Gordon kind of deal with the ramifications of that and daydream a little bit about, well, life in Canada might have been this way, and I miss the boyfriend that I had in Canada, and perhaps we could have had this for your life. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering for yourself, as the person who did come to Canada, not to live out, but that's been the outcome. Yeah. Is there anything that you kind of miss or think about your own road not taken?
No, I don't really miss anything. I often weigh the racism that's there, usually unmentioned, against the homophobia that I would have had to live. And there's no comparison. At the very least, most Canadians are polite, and even if they're racist, they're not going to tell you so. Mm. Whereas in Saint Vincent, people wear their homophobia on their sleeves. and they trumpet it across large spaces, and they say virulent things in the newspaper. You can't really get away from that. So I often say that Canada is an imperfect place. Every country, to some extent, is. But I found a space here to be myself as an intellectual, as a gay man, and also finding a very satisfying career. I mean, I even have a boyfriend, and I can talk about that openly. It would have been virtually impossible to do that in Saint Vincent.
Yeah, I suppose good that you feel like the right decision was made in that sense. But yeah, thank you for kind of walking me through that. You mentioned this idea of imperfection and Canada being an imperfect country. And I feel like this is a piece of the discourse that I do want to wade into, right? Because so much of our discussion about what it means to be Canadian, what it means to live in Canada in 2025 really does focus on these elements of imperfection, on the fact that we're in a post-colonial state and that colonialism has shaped the fabric of our nation so much.
Yep.
And we see the legacy of colonialism definitely in a different hurricane as well. Like the fact that the characters in your novel are looking at going to school in Canada, other islands in the Caribbean or in the UK is a product of these all being countries that are or were in the Commonwealth.
Right.
There's interactions that Gordon has with this white neighbor who has a long family history in the Caribbean, but also pines for these good old days of empire and kind of thinks like things were better managed back in the 60s. There's these interesting dynamics where you're writing about this long shadow of empire and colonialism.
Absolutely.
What did you want to explore with that dynamic?
You know, St. Vincent boasts that it has no racial issue to deal with. And that is so false. There is still shadism in St. Vincent. Very, very, very much so. There are people in St. Vincent white folks who think that independence was a mistake. There are people who resent, particularly mixed-race people, who have descended from mixed-race people with a long heritage. And now, of course, their children have to compete with blacks, you know, in a sort of even way for scholarships and positions and so on and so forth. And as Maureen says, at the time when the brown folks got pretty much all the good things that the white folks didn't want, that's no longer the case. Everyone has to compete. She also mentions the fact of white privilege, which she thinks is what Austin is complaining about, the loss of white privilege.
Yeah, Austin being that neighbor character that we mentioned earlier. I want to take a broad view of this novel, you know, at this point in the conversation. I feel like this is a novel that explores so much the cost of not living true to oneself, whether that is in terms of one's identity, one's sort of sexual orientation, one's desires about even, you know, your feelings about your family, what career you want to pursue. I'm curious for you as somebody who has had a long career working in education as a writer, as a public figure, and as somebody who's had to navigate your own identity, what has your mindset been, I suppose, in terms of staying true to oneself, one's identity, one's principles?
In the early years, actually, particularly in the 1980s, late 70s, mid-80s, I tutored kids on a Saturday morning, volunteer. And I made the decision to keep my homosexuality hidden because of the number of times I'd heard black parents say, I don't want my child 10 foot within, they would have used the F word at the time. And so it was more important to offer that service to black kids than to make an issue of my identity. In fact, I frankly say that in the early years, it was more important to be black than to be gay. Of course, there were people who knew. There were friends of mine that I told. That was pretty much how I negotiated the terrain in those days.
How do you navigate these sorts of questions now? Is there a navigation that still has to take place of balancing different parts of your life, your career, your identity kind of against one another?
One of the things I do in spaces where people don't know me is identify myself as gay. In part because I played the role of an advocate once I came out of the closet for gay rights in Saint Vincent, responding to homophobic statements in the press and educating people about gay reality. Of course, my relatives in the Caribbean did not like it and pleaded with me to stop, but I continued. And here, especially when I'm in black audiences, I make that very, very clear because I do want people to confront their homophobia. And that would be my answer.
Nigel, I want to thank you so much for sharing so much of your life and your thoughts with me in this interview and with all of us through your work. I've really enjoyed talking with you today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, and I'm glad I've had the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. And I'm also glad that you like the novel.
That was my conversation with H. Nigel Thomas, author of A Different Hurricane. And he joined us from Montreal. This episode was produced by Ryan B. Patrick with help from Barb Carey. Ailey Yamamoto is our associate producer. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk, and our executive producer is Aaron Balser. Big shout out to our audio tech Aronde Williams and to the entire CBC Books team. If you enjoyed this conversation, you might also like my interview with the Turkish writer Ayşegül Savaş. We spoke about her nomadic life and how she set down roots in Paris. Take a listen.
I mean, it's strange. Paris is the city where I lived the longest in my whole life, and I've only lived here for a little over a decade. I guess that sense of not having a home and making a home of a new city, a foreign city, this idea that I have no childhood home to return to, and yet, you know, humans have a desire for home, to feel rooted. And I guess I also started writing the novel at a certain threshold in my life when I realized that I was perhaps not young anymore, or that I was about to become not young. And it was this painful discovery that, you know, one feels young and yet also has to make decisions and take on big responsibilities. And I wanted to somehow, before I officially was no longer young, I wanted to encapsulate that time of being irresponsible, but being irresponsible grown-ups.
You can head to the link in the description to catch the rest of that conversation with Ayşegül Savaş. And while you're at it, make sure you hit the follow button so you don't miss any of the great guests we have coming up on the show. And bonus points if you leave us a review if you've been enjoying the show. It really does help us to get the word out to other folks who might enjoy listening to us. I'm Matea Roach, and this is Bookends. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.